Alright, so let's get started on exposure control. Now, there are several things we need to deal with. We are going to be dealing with aperture, shutter speed, and ISO to control the quality of your images. This week we're going to concentrate on two of them, aperture and shutter speed. ISO we will touch on, but we will look at that later in another segment. So apertures first. Apertures allow light into the lens or into the camera via the lens. A large aperture will allow more light, while a smaller aperture will allow less light. That's pretty simple so far. And all of this is going on in the lens, and you set this by a numeric equivalent on your lens. So f-stops and shutter speeds have to work together. Now, different types of modes in your camera, like program or aperture priority, shutter priority, and manual, all regulate how these different numbers go together. We're going to talk about those in just a minute. But the top line of numbers you see here are your f-stops, and depending on your camera, you may have more or less of these f-stops when you start to configure or look at your camera. Shutter speed's the same way. You'll see the B and the 1 down there on the left. That is 1 second, and it goes all the way up to 1/500th. Now your camera again may go as far as 1/8,000th of a second. So shutter speeds and f-stops work as reciprocals. When you have the right exposure or the right combination of numbers dialed into your camera to make a correct exposure, they have a reciprocal value. In other words, an increase in one will require a decrease in another to maintain the same amount of light hitting the sensor. So there are different types of modes that you're going to work with. For instance, when you're on automatic or program mode in your camera, the camera's making all the decisions for you. In other words, you're nothing more than a tripod. This will yield you usually a pretty good quality product, but does limit the creativity by which you can use. There are different modes available to you. Program we've already talked about. The camera is making all relevant decisions as far as shutter speed and aperture. There's aperture priority, where you choose the aperture and the camera determines the shutter speed. This can work pretty good sometimes, but again result in fuzzy photographs if you're not aware of the type of light that you are in or the amount of light. There's also shutter priority, where you choose the shutter speed, the camera will determine the aperture. Both of these modes, shutter priority and aperture priority, are viable depending on your subject matter and how you're working. Now, what I prefer to use and what I urge you to try, at least as far as this class goes, is manual mode, where you are in full control of both f-stop and shutter speed. So exposure reciprocals work this way. Let's just take an example. You have an initial exposure reading of f11 at 1/30th of a second. In other words, your camera tells you that that is going to give you a good exposure. You're using your meter and it's giving you the green light, so to speak, to shoot the picture. You're going to have a good product. However, if as you progress in this class, you'll understand that 1/30th of a second is too slow of a shutter speed to get a good quality sharp image. You're going to have camera shake just from your hands. You'd have to steady the camera somehow, tripod or tabletop or something like that, to get a good sharp image. So you want to use a little faster shutter speed. So in this case, we decide we're going to use 1/25th of a second. Okay, so when we do that, when we move our shutter speed from 1/30th to 1/25th of a second, 125th of a second, we have shortened the amount of time that the shutter is open in the camera. To compensate for that, we have to adjust the lens to f5.6, as you see in the diagram here. f5.6 at 1/25th of a second is exactly the same amount of light as f11 at 1/30th. This is what we mean by reciprocals. The second exposure you'll see is significantly different from the first and will yield a different result, but as far as light goes, it is the same amount of light. So the third component of exposure is ISO. Now this is the setting which changes the sensitivity of light to your camera's sensor. Like I said, we're going to look at this later on, but a good way to think about this right now is it allows you to compensate for, say, bright places like on the beach where you have lots of light and reflection, or allows you to get better pictures in low light situations like inside an office building or something like that. Again, more on ISO to come in a future lecture, but that's essentially what changing the ISO numbers of your camera will allow you to do, is change the sensitivity of your sensor. So various type of meter windows look like this. Now this is kind of a very basic organization of what it might look like. There are much more exotic ways with your digital camera, which we'll get into later. But essentially, you have a meter reading on either side. You'll have a plus and a minus, which will relate to the idea of whether you are underexposed or overexposed. In other words, you have too much light or not enough light coming to the sensor. But when you get the green light, that means your exposure is right. On the right, the same idea, except you would want the needle flatlined, and when you do that, it will give you a good exposure. On the bottom, you'll see an f-stop and shutter speed represented down there on the bottom, and in between you might have a indicator going back and forth on whether it is plus or minus. Now that's what most of you will have in your digital camera. The idea is to get used to your meters. Now a little digression here, if you were shooting with color film, you would end up with a result that would look like this as far as the negative goes, and then went through a reversal. It would go through a reversal process, and it would then give you the correct color image when it was printed. In black and white, the principle again is the same. The proper combination exposure of shutter speed and f-stop will create an exposure that will give you a good print. Now in this case, in black and white, again, it is a reversal process where you're working with film, you're creating a negative. So where the cheek is the brightest would be your highlight, and where your shadow area is, like in the hair, would be your detail. This principle is the same whether you're shooting digital, film, or whatever. It's always the same in photography. So in a black and white situation, or doing it analog, not digital, you would create a negative like this. And this is the reversal of the print that you saw on the other image. Again, the principle is the same in digital as it is in film. If you give it too much light, you're going to get a washed out event. It's not going to look right. If you give it less light, it's going to get too dark. It's not going to look right. So the wrong combination of shutter speed and f-stop, especially when you're working with manual, will create adverse results unless creatively you are on top of it. By the time we get through with this course, you're going to understand how this works, and you're going to be able to utilize this to improve your images. So remember, the meter reading is your starting point of the technical side of your picture composition. In other words, you want to get the technical side right first. So when you use your meter on the camera, and again, I'm emphasizing manual mode here, make sure you have the correct ISO setting for your film or sensor that you are using. Okay, this is the camera's sensitivity of light. Make sure you check your meter with every shot. Now, this is discipline, takes a while. Develop a habit of metering various parts of a scene, like spot metering. More on that later as well. Make sure you understand what your meter is telling you as far as overexposure, too much light, or underexposure, not enough light. These are graphics that show you the type of metering that you have in different cameras. The center weighted metering here on the left is the average, or how most cameras are defaulted as far as metering. Everything that is white is measured by the camera. Partial metering is another effect, and spot metering, you can see, goes down and gets even more specific on a scene. Like again, default, most cameras are center weighted metering. So now, how do exposure equivalents work? Okay, exposure equivalents work like this. You have an exposure of f16 at 1/25th of a second. Okay, you have decided that you want to change that to 1/250th. You've got some action, you want to stop some action or whatever, so you want to use 1/25th of a second. What would be your new exposure, or your new f-stop? Your new f-stop would be f11 at 1/250th of a second. You have cut the amount of time that the shutter is open in half, from 1/125th to 1/250th. You have to compensate and open the aperture one stop to f11. The reciprocals work this way. When you affect one, you have to affect the other, and this will allow you to maintain different types of exposures and good exposures in different type of situations, like this variety of pictures from Hawaii that I shot years ago. Now, try another one here. Your exposure is f4 at 1/500th of a second, but you decide that you need a little more depth of field. If you've watched the other videos, you know what I'm talking about. If not, then that's your next step. You decide to shoot at f8. What is your new shutter speed? Well, the new shutter speed, again, f8, is a 2-stop difference. We go f4, if we go up 1 stop, it's 5/6. 2 stops is f8, which means we have cut the light twice, okay? We have the light down twice, which means we have to extend the amount of time the shutter is open, so we go from 1/500th of a second to 1/125th. Now, by now, you're probably getting this by now, although I have to admit it takes a while for all of us. Okay, last one. Exposure is f11 at 1/60th of a second. We decide we want to shoot at f3.5. Okay, what is our new exposure, or our new, what is our new shutter speed? Well, this one's a little trickier. Okay, our new exposure is f3.5 at 1/500th of a second. We have opened up the lens considerably from f11 to 3.5, so this time we have to count it back. f11, okay, f8, 5/6, f4 or 3.5 would be the same, be a 3-stop difference. So we go 1/60th, we go up 1/125th, 1/125th, 1/250th, 1/500th of a second. All of these are the same amount of light falling on the sensor as the top line. It just means that it has intrinsic differences to the photograph that allows you to be more creative with different aspects. Mastering the way reciprocals operate takes experience. It is not something you can do overnight. A good way to remember this is a little phrase that I use all the time: half or double, half or double. When you move up the scale, like on your f-stops from, say, f2.8 to f11, every stop or increment there by the numbers, you are halving or cutting the light in half. If you move the other way from f11 towards f2.8, you are doubling the amount of light every time you open to an f-stop. Same goes for shutter speeds. Those are marked as fractions. This is a good way to remember it. Again, don't figure you're going to master this quickly. I have a little handout on Blackboard. Take a look at it, read it, print it out, take it with you as you shoot when you want to master this. Go on to the next couple of video clips here, and we'll start talking about depth of field and how shutter speeds interact.